Well, folks, America is mourning. America is mourning the loss of our brightest Russian son, Alexei Navalny. A brave crusader for American interests, he died in captivity as a prisoner of war in a Russian Arctic prison. He supposedly was out for a walk when he collapsed and died as a result of some kind of blood clot thing. That's what they're saying. But we all know that what really happened was Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin drove up to the Arctic Circle personally, and he pulled out his God, what was it? A PSM? Is it with those little vest pocket guns that the KGB used to carry, the 5.45 by 18 guns? Pulled one of those out from his vest pocket, and he put one, or more likely 2 or 3, right between Navalny's eyes, and then he watched as the life faded from his body. Because, in the words of American Sentinel Bill O'Reilly, Putin's a killer. And so we will all put the flags at half staff for at least a week in mourning this great loss. And we will do retrospectives on television. There will be documentaries about the great life lived by Alexei Navalny, America's brightest sun under the Russian sky. And you know what? As sarcastic as I'm being, I'm not that far off from the truth of what the media is engaged in right now. It has been a cavalcade of mourners on cable news and online, all over Twitter. They're just so sad that this random guy in Russia who never got more than like 2% of the vote died in prison. Now, that's not an endorsement of his death. It's not an exoneration of the Russian government. I'm not saying that the Russian government didn't just off this guy. It very well might be the case. That happens. That happens in plenty of countries. That happens in my own country. Governments have a way of eliminating dissidents, even if they're not necessarily by themselves a threat to the health of the regime itself. Not every dissident has to be, super high profile. In fact, when they're higher profile, sometimes it makes it harder to assassinate them. It would be hard for the CIA to just send someone up to Mr. Trump in the middle of a rally and blow his brains out. That would be really obvious. So they can't really get away with that with someone who is of a sufficiently high profile. But somebody like Navalny is, within Russia, is not a high-profile individual at all from what I've seen. Lots of photos you see of him at events and things where, like, he's not even the organizer, he's just, like, in attendance. He's a guy who's involved in, he's a political activist in Russia. But, they keep calling him the opposition leader. He's not the leader of the opposition in Russia, from what I understand. Not by a long shot, unless you're calling the opposition in Russia like a small sliver of the population, like 2%. He is someone who seems to be out of the mainstream of even like Russian liberalism, because there are Russian liberals. You see, Navalny's thing is that I can't remember who I first heard make this comparison, but he really seems to be like the Russian equivalent of like a Lyndon LaRouche. During the Cold War, Lyndon LaRouche was this crazy commie cultist guy who the Soviet Union told their people was like the leader of the opposition in America, and he's going to lead the revolution. And he's this great hero of the workers, Lyndon LaRouche, who is beloved by Americans, but is held down by the fascist occupation regime in Washington. And while yes, Lyndon LaRouche was certainly an enemy of the American government, he was not He was not someone who had any like real support amongst the American people. It was a total fabrication by the Soviet government. And it seems to be, what Lyndon LaRouche really was he was the voice of like of just pro-Soviet people in America. That was what Lyndon LaRouche was all about. He loved the Soviet Union, and Americans who also liked the Soviet Union and wanted to join them supported Lyndon LaRouche. And so Navalny is the same way. He was a very pro-Washington guy. His whole platform was, hey, we need to just, become a part of, the Washington-led world order, and we want to follow in their lead, and we want to be a junior partner in the American empire, just like Britain, France, or Germany. And from everything I've seen, that is not a popular position in Russia. That's not something that people in Russia really want. There's some people maybe who want that, and those people, they voted for Alexei Navalny. But even amongst Russian liberals who don't like Putin and are much more aligned, let's say, politically with people like Emmanuel Macron, the European liberals, they still don't want to, in terms of foreign policy, submit to America. They don't want to go along with all that. They still want to have their own independent foreign policy. They don't want to become an American satellite, but they want a country that is more like the West. That is kind of, they want to have the same sort of culture and values that the West has. They want to be more secular. They want to be more gay. All of this stuff. They're kind of, I don't want to use the term woke because the term woke, what we call woke here in America doesn't exist in other countries. But they're more in line with Western Europe. And there's always been a contingent within Russian society that wanted to be more like Western Europe. That's kind of a classic theme in Russian history. Not that I haven't studied Russian history extensively. Don't get me wrong, I'm no Russian history expert, but that's, it's a common thing. In the last few hundred years, there's this debate within Russia: do we want to be more like the West, or do we want to, maintain our differences? Do we want to become, I don't want to say more like ourselves, but more distinguished from the West? Do we want to be more distinct? Or do we want to assimilate more into Western culture? And there have been different leaders throughout Russian history who have been on either side of that debate. Navalny is not that. Navalny is not Peter the Great learning to speak French because he wants to keep up with Western culture. Navalny is a classic, Juan Guaido type of character. At least that's the way I always understood him when he was alive. Now that he is dead and in the afterlife, may he rest in peace. He is no longer that. And honestly, while I have no problem assuming that the Russian government killed him, you could even make an argument that the CIA killed him. Because in prison, he's not really of much use as this, pro-NATO leader anymore. But his death would help the narrative against Russia, especially at a time, perhaps when people are, let's say, more skeptical of trying to send billions of dollars to help Ukraine, or less uncomfortable with the ideas of Russia, and less afraid of Putin. You could argue that this sort of a news story helps the U.S. government much more than it helps the Russian government. Then again, if that were the case, I think the Russians would be the first ones telling us about it, and they would be trying to present their case that Navalny was murdered by the CIA. The Russian government wouldn't just come out and say, oh yeah, Navalny died of natural causes today. And the other thing is, they didn't just disappear the guy. He's dead, And they put that on, that was national news. They put it on TV. It was on RT, which is Russian state television. So Russian state television came out and says, yes, this guy is dead, that the West, is obsessed with for some reason. Oh my God, I went over 10 minutes. I can't believe it. And I haven't mentioned Gonzalo yet, because that's the whole reason I wanted to talk about this, is that the media is obsessed with Navalny and didn't give a damn, of course, about Gonzalo. And the difference here is that Navalny is a NATO stooge, and Gonzalo was an enemy of the American regime and the military-industrial complex. And so they're much more concerned, let's just assume, in both cases, these prisoners were murdered by the governments that were imprisoning them. They don't give a damn about the American citizen who was murdered by this foreign government, but they do care about the Russian citizen who was allegedly, according to them, murdered by his own government. The U.S. media thinks that is much more in the interest of the American people. We should be much more concerned about a Russian guy who was murdered, in a supposedly died under suspicious circumstances in a Russian prison versus an American who was murdered in a Ukrainian prison. And so that is to show you that the ruling class in America doesn't value the lives of Americans as such. They never have. What they do value is the lives of their political allies. And so if you are not on their side, they're not going to be on your side. As far as they're concerned, if you don't go along with what they want, you're already dead. If you don't support NATO, if you don't support giving more money to Raytheon, if you don't support bombing more brown people, you're going to end up like Batman in that Suicide Squad game. That's how they feel about you. And the regime is Harley Quinn. That represents the dynamic between America's ruling class and the regular citizen who is concerned about themselves and about their family and about their communities. The ruling class, if they had their way, would tie us all to millions and millions of chairs, make us all sit through a struggle session where all the folks in the gallery, in the audience who are shouting at us are American bureaucrats, lobbyists, and gender studies students, all yelling about how evil we are for not sending money to Ukraine, and then they finish it off by blowing our brains out. And you wonder why these people write scenes like that. It's because that's what they want to do. To them, that's fun. To them, that is justice. That's what was done to Gonzalo Lira. And they were happy about it. But the thought that that the same fate might have befallen their pet Alexei Navalny, and they are literally shaken, to borrow a phrase. They're apoplectic. They are completely at a loss at how Putin could be so evil. Meanwhile, the U.S. has been sustaining two major wars, both major wars in the world, the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine, fed by American munitions and American money. Both of those wars would be over and would have resulted in far less death and destruction had the United States just minded its own business. That's what the rest of the world sees. But the American elite can't see anything past their own victimhood. They have the gall to look at this state of the world and to point to Navalny's death and say, we're the real victims here. Gonzalo got what he had coming, but Navalny is our man. Nobody touches him. And so if the Biden administration is happy to have Americans murdered outside of our borders, either directly by the U.S. military or indirectly by a proxy force like Ukraine, how long until they start openly killing us here. How long before you have American dissidents in prison? Or we know that this already happens to some people, but in a larger scale, ending up like what they say befell Mr. Navalny. I mean, we know this already happens. This has happened throughout American history in different periods. But I mean on a mass scale, where Americans just start getting arrested for their views, and then thrown in prison where they die under suspicious circumstances. I don't know. I hope it never happens on a wide scale. Because again, always happening on a small scale. But anyway, with that said, I will see you folks back here in the next one.